Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues site event. Today's topic is language rights are human rights, participating in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. My name is Kevin Miller. I am the American Indian Law Program Fellow at the University of Colorado Law School. We will be holding a Q&A session toward the end of the meeting. You will be able to participate using the raise hand function or the Zoom chat, and that will be moderated by Professor Kristen Carpenter, who directs the American Indian Law Program at the University of Colorado Law School. And I would now like to welcome Kristen to begin with opening remarks.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for your incredible work on this event and all of our projects. Good day to our participants and panelists. Welcome to this session entitled Language Rights are Human Rights, Participating in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022 to 2023. This is a side event and webinar of the Implementation Project, a joint initiative of the Native American Rights Fund and University of Colorado Law School to advance education and advocacy concerning the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As Kevin said, I'm Kristen Carpenter, a professor at the University of Colorado, and together with Sue Noe at the Native American Rights Fund, I co-direct the Implementation Project from our home base in Boulder, Colorado. Today, however, I'm joining you from the United Nations in New York, where hundreds of Indigenous peoples have gathered for the 21st session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, of which this is a side event. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and especially our speakers, Dr. Ofelia Zepeda, Chief Ben Barnes, and Dr. Gabriel Perez Baez. I would also like to thank, as always, Sue Noe, and Kevin and Sarah Organ at the Native American Rights Fund, and our entire teams who make these events possible. First, a bit of background. We founded the Implementation Project in 2018 to help realize the aims of the Declaration in the US. The Declaration is a powerful instrument recognizing the individual and collective human rights of Indigenous peoples, their rights to exist as distinct societies, to exercise self-determination, along with rights of religion, culture, land, and of course, language. It also recognizes corresponding obligations of states, including the United States, to remedy past deprivations of those rights. The Declaration was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007 and supported by the United States in 2010. In 2014, all member states of the United Nations, including the US, committed to take measures to achieve the ends of the Declaration. But in some regards, progress to achieve the ends of the Declaration has been very slow and painstaking, and one of those areas is language rights. As we know, the languages of Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada and Mexico and really around the world were targets of national and church efforts to assimilate Indigenous peoples through boarding schools where children were punished for speaking their Indigenous languages. Very sadly, graves are being found on many of the grounds of those schools, and our states are just beginning, I think, especially the United States, to account for the harms created and perpetuated during those times. As we know, Indigenous languages also suffered so much through this and other forms of discrimination in education, voting, health, media, and so on, that most Indigenous languages are severely endangered and others are on the brink of dormancy. Article 13 of the Declaration recognizes that Indigenous peoples have the rights to revitalize, use, and transmit their languages to future generations. And states, again, have obligations to remedy past harms. The entire UN system committed to the Decade of Indigenous Languages, 10 years from 2022 to 2032, to help realize that right articulated under the Declaration. And other rights, because as we know, language rights are human rights and they're deeply indivisible. So language rights relate to and are essential for religion, for health, for expression, family, and other realms of life. Language rights are also connected to experiences of well-being, as in sustainable development and conflict prevention and peace. Accordingly, the UN General Resolution calls on all states, Indigenous peoples, and others to take urgent action to ensure Indigenous peoples' language rights at the national and international level. In terms of making it happen practically, the resolution from the General Assembly, quote, invites member states, that is national governments, to consider establishing national mechanisms with adequate funding for the successful implementation of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and invites Indigenous peoples as custodians of their own languages to initiate and develop appropriate measures for the implementation of the International Decade. In terms of the current situation in the US, I think it's safe to say that the second thing is happening. Indigenous peoples are initiating and developing measures for the implementation of the International Decade. But the first thing is not happening. The United States has not established a national mechanism with any funding for successful implementation of the decade. We had invited somebody from the United States government to speak on this panel, and they canceled last night. And so it goes. When the federal government will not advance Indigenous peoples' rights, Indigenous peoples do it on their own, both in their home communities and at the United Nations. For example, in addition to our speakers today, Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation, Chuck Hoskin, was here at the United Nations just last week to address the Permanent Forum and share his tribe's incredible commitments to language revitalization, including programs to employ speakers, multi-generational language villages, and interpretation for elder speakers when they go in for health services. Cherokee Nation also held the very first launch event for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages anywhere in the world. And I was so proud of them for hosting that international event in Tahlequah, having speakers from every continent centered in the Cherokee Nation. At that event, Chief Hoskins said it had been the work of national governments to destroy Indigenous languages, and it should be the work of national governments to work with Indigenous peoples to restore them during the decade. He called strongly on the United States to express support for the decade and develop a national action plan. Whether our government and other governments will do that remains to be seen, but in the meantime, other Indigenous peoples will. Some of the themes we may discuss today include relationships between language rights and other rights, as we just said, between linguists and tribal governments, and federal policy changes that would support the decade. I am pleased now to introduce the three leaders in this field who will discuss their own work, their own engagements with the decade. Each will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will have questions and answers. I'm going to introduce the speakers in reverse order of their appearance, ending with our first speaker. Dr. Ofelia Zepeda is Tohono O'odham, Regents Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, and a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship for her nationally and internationally known work in American Indian language education and recovery. She wrote the first pedagogical grammar of the Tohono O'odham language, a Tohono O'odham grammar. She is director of the American Indian Language Development Institute, a 40-year institute serving the needs of Native American language educators, researchers, and activists. She's also a member of the Global Task Force for the United Nations International Decade of Indigenous Languages and has been representing many of us from the US National Organizing Committee in those efforts throughout the world. Ofelia writes in both O'odham and English and has 3 books of poetry: Ocean Power, Poems from the Desert, Juet Ihoy, Earth Movements, and Where Clouds Are Formed. In 2019, she was the poet collaborator on the project Where Clouds Are Formed, a photographic essay on the US border as it intersects with Tohono O'odham lands. In 2021, her work appeared in When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, edited by Joy Harjo, US Poet Laureate. And I will say, whenever we work with Indigenous languages in these programs, and especially Indigenous linguists, they always know Ofelia, who has seemed to mentor all of them at one point or another in their careers. Chief Ben Barnes from the Shawnee Tribe will be our middle speaker. He is chief of the Shawnee Tribe, one of the 3 federally recognized Shawnee nations, whose histories interweave with more than 20 states. Ben's framework of understanding stems not only from the vantage point of political office, but from a traditional cultural framework of belonging to the White Oak Ceremonial Stomp Ground, a place where the traditional religion for Shawnee people is practiced. Having witnessed firsthand the struggle of community elders working to ensure the continued survival of the Shawnee religion and language, it is from this deep and personal connection that upholding the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and human rights activism has become cornerstone of the Shawnee Tribe's government. Chief Barnes' tenure as the elected chief of the Shawnee Tribe began in 2019, just before the pandemic. What a time to start. But immediately upon taking office, Chief Barnes declared a state of emergency for the Shawnee language. Subsequently, in accord with UNESCO's efforts around the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, the Shawnee Tribe named 2020 the Year of Shawnee Language, and 2021 began the Decade of the Shawnee Language. Chief Barnes has also been part of the endeavor to ensure that the ancient earthworks within the Shawnee homelands receive the UNESCO World Heritage Inscription to aid in the preservation of these sacred Indigenous sites. And I'll note that Chief Barnes was also here at the United Nations last week and gave a very powerful statement on the floor in front of hundreds of representatives from national governments and tribes regarding the need to investigate, account for, and remedy harms perpetuated during the boarding school era and their ongoing ramifications. Dr. Gabriela Perez-Baez is an academic expert in Indigenous languages and language revitalization. At the University of Oregon, she's an associate professor of linguistics. She's also the director of the Language Revitalization Lab and co-director of the National Breath of Life Archival Institute for Indigenous Languages. Gabriela served as curator of linguistics at the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, and in its Recovering Voices initiative. Her research focuses on revitalization practices around the world. In her native Mexico, Gabriela works with Zapotec communities and has published on migration and language vitality, verbal inflection and derivation, semantic typology, language and cognition. Gabriela is the compiler of 2 dictionaries of Zapotec within a participatory and interdisciplinary model. She holds a doctorate in linguistics from the University of Buffalo and has many publications in the field. We first met in Canada at an event of the International Year, I think, of Indigenous Languages that also brought together language activists with Indigenous leaders, linguists, and researchers. And we're really happy to now give the floor to Dr. Perez, who will share some of her research, including surveys and qualitative data linking language with sustainable development. And thank you very much, Dr. Perez.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be here alongside Dr. Ophelia Cepeda, Chief Ben Barnes, and Dr. Carpenter. So thank you for the opportunity. And let me just share. Let's make sure that you're viewing the slide fine, right? Okay, very good. So my presentation will be bilingual in that the slides will be mostly in Spanish, but I'll be presenting in English. Hopefully I won't have any bilingual interference. And I'll be talking about the relevance of linguistic diversity and linguistic vitality in sustainable development. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I am presenting today from Kalapuya Ilihi, which is the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people, the first peoples of the Willamette Valley, whose descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. My objective today is to illustrate the relevance of linguistic diversity and linguistic vitality in sustainable development by way of the voices of those who are advocating for linguistic rights and who are working as language revitalizationists around the world. So I will first show you some, I'll introduce you to the survey of language revitalization efforts, which is where the data comes from. and I will weave those into the UN Sustainable Development Goals from the 2030 agenda, and then I'll offer some conclusions. So let me talk to you about this survey. This is the first, to my knowledge, the first effort to analyze language revitalization efforts around the world in a comparative manner so that we could learn from the ensemble of efforts and to try to identify some correlations that might help us develop better strategies to support revitalization. By revitalization, I am referring to all efforts intended to promote the use of a particular language and to strengthen its vitality. That might refer to efforts to maintain a language that is vital and has children learning and using it, but also to efforts to reclaim a language that went dormant at some point and is being revitalized from that point onwards. I've included a QR code for an open access paper, which provides much more results on that survey if you're interested. I just want to acknowledge that the results that are from that the survey itself is a large collaborative effort that involved the Smithsonian Institution, the University of Hawaii Manoa, the International Center for Language Revitalization, and the University of Oregon, with the assistance and collaboration of a number of colleagues, Rachel Vogel, Wia Patolo, Alex Orion, and Stacia Henry. So this survey, we ran it between 2014 and 2017. We gathered 245 surveys from around the world. Here are some numbers of the number of surveys per region according to the Endangered Languages Catalog. The regions come from the Endangered Languages Catalog division of the world. And of course, there's a difference in the level of representation from each region, but we gathered surveys from all around the world, including Syria at the peak of the war. So let's take a look at some relevant data. What made me think about weaving these data into the agenda, the 2030 agenda, is that I noticed that language does not figure prominently in the agenda. And in fact, to the best of my knowledge, it only appears in Article 19, which is a non-discrimination article that comes from the Universal Declaration of Linguistic Rights. And this surprised me. So I took a look at the data from question 10 from the survey, which reads, what are the main objectives of the efforts to revitalize your language? And from question 25, why is it important to revitalize your language? So we got 475 responses to question 10 and 87 to question 25. And what I'll show you today is a very small selection of quotes, but the most illustrative ones for each of the points I want to make in relation to specific goals in the agenda. So for instance, with regards to the goal related to peace, justice, and institutions, sorry, there's a modifier in there in the English title of the goal, which I'm forgetting, so apologies for that. But we have 4 quotes here. One respondent who is revitalizing Nahuatl in Mexico pointed out that it's very important to have specialized interpreters to support the resolution of conflicts in the judicial, criminal, and healthcare field. For Wampanoag in the United States, which is a language that has been revitalized from a point of dormancy, the respondent states that by revitalizing the language, we can begin to repair the centuries of colonial assault on Wampanoag language, use, and cultural practices. We have a quote written in Russian related to the revitalization of Karelian, where the importance of language revitalization is related to restoring historical injustice. Very similar quote. For Baniva in Venezuela, the relevance is, well, it's important to promote intercultural dialogue between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples with the purpose of overcoming the disadvantages and discrimination against Indigenous languages and cultures. In relation to the goal related to ecosystems, to nature, the respondent for the language, Durga in Australia, stated that language and culture are linked, and language tells us about the land we live on. For Gumbaingir, also in Australia, the relevance of revitalizing and sustaining the language is for the health of our land. For Anishinaabe, native language is spirituality, and it connects you to the earth and nature. For Tihlini in the west of the United States, because the language and the land is who we are, that is one of the reasons they are revitalizing the language. Language vitality is also considered important for industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So for instance, for Baltic, the respondent working on Baltic, Prussian, and Masurian finds it important for the language or languages to be used in the internet. For Croatian, which although is a language that has state support, it is the respondent was reporting that the language does not have good presence online, and therefore one of their objectives is to make the language available online. For Gauri in Pakistan, also similarly, they find it important to have a website for promotion of the language. A respondent regarding a Quechua language is working on machine translation to and from English and Spanish, thereby pointing out the importance of this work in the advancement of machine translation technology. For Ersia Mordovian in also Central Asia, it is they're looking for introduction of language into the sphere of office work, so ensuring that by way of the that the workspace is not exclusionary on the basis of language. Something very similar for Galician in Spain. They are very focused on entry of Galician into the private workplace. Now I'm going to spend a little more time on two goals. The first is education and the second is health and well-being. So in education, of course, the objective for guarantees inclusive, equitable, and quality, or seeks to guarantee equitable, inclusive, and quality education. And this aligns very strongly with a very strong focus in the Revitalization Survey on quality of education. So for example, with regards to literacy, for Baniva in Venezuela, they are working towards developing textbooks, especially those that teach literacy, bilingual literacy in the school. For Dajim in Nigeria, they are working to provide literary materials in the language. For Iquito in Peru, they're teaching interested community members the basics of speaking, reading, and writing the language. And so, you know, you see this very strong focus on literacy. And if we think about the fact that, and I'm hoping the UNESCO is working on a survey of world languages that they hope to, a report of which they hope to release soon. And some of the results show that about half the languages of the world are not written in a systematic way. So when we think about literacy and the importance given to literacy in sustainable development goals, we have to realize that without proper writing systems and literacy programs in the local languages, any literacy effort will be in a dominant language and will displace a local language. There's a great focus on training for teachers. So for instance, for Kanyenkeha in Canada and the US, they are looking towards preparing students to be teachers of future generations. For Cornish in the UK, more teachers so we can teach in schools and create a new generation. For the Sano in Brazil and Colombia, training also for teachers. So strong focus on ensuring that the teachers will be in line with community needs and also with the concept of quality of education as defined by the communities themselves. There's a strong focus on expanding bilingual education in urban Chuvashia. And this is actually the topic of bilingualism and not monolingualism is very salient in the data from this survey, unlike the monolingual models of quality education that have been imposed in large regions of the world and have displaced languages. Let me focus on health and well-being. In the respondent for HALCOM-LM in Canada and the US states that language supports everything: health, identity, connection to the past, one's ancestors, generations before and after, and fundamentally ways of being human. So for this and many other participants, language is crucial for health and well-being of the community members. It is for the respondent for Southwest Ojibwe, language is important for healing from generational trauma. For the respondent for Anarsami in Finland, reclaiming your own Indigenous endangered language seems to be extremely healing in both personal and collective level. For well-being is tied to self-esteem in the eyes of many of these respondents. For Karna in Australia, for instance, the language is important to raise self-esteem, health, and well-being. For Klalam in the United States, it is important to increase the pride, self-esteem, and empowerment of community members. And finally, for the respondent for Mystic in the western regions of Huslahuaca in Mexico, it is important to have resources for health workers, especially interpreters, so that patients have access to medical care. So pointing out the fact that it is on the basis of the language of the individual, of the patient, that people are often marginalized from adequate health care. So with this, I will close just to state that I have presented data not from me, but from the words, from the voices of those who are protecting linguistic diversity, cultural diversity around the world. And they all point to a need for policies at the regional, national, and international level to protect linguistic vitality as a strategy to promote the respect of human rights and to promote sustainable development. So with the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, we have an opportunity to articulate an international legal instrument to protect linguistic rights and therefore promote sustainable development. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perez. That was amazing. I mean, the research you've done and the methodology of bringing forth Indigenous people's own statements about the importance of language and then linking it to human rights and the SDGs in particular is so important. Many people may know that the SDGs are supposed to be cross-cutting across the United Nations. All agencies are working towards sustainable development. And I think you're absolutely right to point out the absence of language in some ways, but the fact that it really informs every single one of the SDGs. And I appreciate you pointing out the peace and conflict, education, health and well-being, and also the fact that your presentation was plurilingual itself, which I think is one of the futures we're all envisioning. I mean, we can try to read in Spanish and speak in English and see Indigenous languages in such a powerful way. So thank you in every respect for your presentation. I know you may not be able to stay for very long, but we will take this to heart and hope to connect with you either on this call or in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity and for the attention.
Of course, of course. I'd now like to pass the parole to my good friend and colleague, Chief Ben Barnes. Chief, you're on mute.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Carpenter. I'm always humbled to be in the presence of Dr. Zepeda and Dr. Perez Baez. Your contributions to language, all I have to offer today is reflections of Shawnee people on our language and things that we've been doing. And so it's, I think that the experiences that Shawnee people have had during our language work, our language recovery, revitalization, I think there's some commonalities and some lessons that we've learned that perhaps may have some benefit to others. And so I hope to share those with you today. And maybe you can find some meaning and some direction from those. So as Kristen said, I'm just a politician. I'm just an elected official. I serve a term of 4 years at the pleasure of my people. And I know that the work that we have that has happened to Shawnee people, they have spent more than 182 years trying to terminate our language, and they built the first Shawnee boarding school to try to get rid of our languages. And they failed. And we're at a place now that we have very few left, handfuls of people left. And myself and my brother, we were language activists and language volunteers, and we found ourselves there by accident. We got old, and we looked around and we thought there'd be older folks that would be available to teach language and to conduct those necessary religious and ceremonial observances that all of our communities have, whether it's the sacred events of birth and death, or the things that we do annually when we come together as a people, as a distinct people, and with our unique customs. And those people were suddenly, we found that they weren't available anymore. They were gone. They had left us. And so it felt to us that we was going to have to reinvigorate the language and find ways to do it. And so it's from that framework, when I became an elected official, that I realized that, I had a pulpit, I had a bully pulpit that I was able to use to benefit of the people, of our people. And so we made a proclamation of a state of emergency for Shawnee language. And subsequently, we named the International Year and the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. We've made corresponding declarations for the Shawnee Decade and the Shawnee Year. But my language team, they're like, so what? What good is this, Ben? What is this going to do for us? We're actually out here trying to teach a language, trying to save a language, and you're these proclamations. And they're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. They're just words on paper until you use them as a tool. And what we was able to do with that was to use the state of emergency declaration to open up doors at academia and institutions that have collections of our people's language materials, to find access to people that is willing to say, hey, we have this such and such product, and we want you to see if you guys would like to work with us. And so with those partnerships that we've developed, whether it's the American Philosophical Society, the Miamia Center, the friends that we have all across the linguistic community of North America, that really helped. That really helped open some of those doors. And the International Year and the International Decade, while they just seem to be words on paper, I want to hold up what Mexico did when Mexico made a declaration that made indigenous languages part of their official languages of their state. It launched and affirmed languages, and you saw dozens and dozens of language programs pop up after Mexico did that subsequently. We've seen the same thing. And ironically, COVID was one of the agents that increased participation in language, because we were able to deploy solutions. No longer were we driving our solutions and driving our classrooms to far corners of our community. We were able to do those on platforms like this. So we have 5 time zones. We're teaching classes during daytime hours, during evening hours. We have 5 days a week. You can find Shawnee language lessons. Those language lessons are now recorded and online. We developed a learning management software to deliver content to our people in the same way that those of you from academic environments where you have Canvas or Blackboard, It's the same type of learning management system that delivers these modules to our citizens. So it was these aspirational documents, international year, international decade, that allowed for these type of planning processes. But knowing that we had what amounted to an 11-year opportunity with the international year and international decade, we was able to start creating a budget. That budget would exist further than the span of just one administration. They'd spent 182 years at least trying to exterminate our languages, and now we had an opportunity to create an 11-year budget, so that when we were seeking out talented people, we were seeking out people that had masters or PhDs, advanced degrees in linguistics or pedagogy or curriculum, they were not afraid to come to work for us. They were not afraid that the A&A grant, the Esther Martinez grant that the tribe may or may not have received, was going to run out in a year or two, and then they would be out of a job. They didn't have to worry about that anymore. They knew that the tribe had an 11-year budget, 11-year commitment to language. So our language team soon realized what good these proclamations were to us. And as we started working through, we started having internal conversations about how language integrates with our people and what rights we have to language. And it's been some reflections that we've had with other folks, like Dr. Perez Baez, about the rights of language, that language itself has its own right, that language in and of itself, from our perspective, has an inherent being in the way that we talk about it. And our language team, as they were putting together and conveying concepts to people, they were encountering new ways of understanding, new ways of, and I know I'm hazarding much in a room full of linguists, but the way the language genders, the way that our language genders, it doesn't gender along normal lines of masculine and feminine like French or other languages. We gender along terms of animus. So we have different ways of talking about things. Just this past week, the Sovereignty Symposium here in Oklahoma always picks a theme for the year and asks for the theme of their meeting. And this year's theme was the earth. And so the way that the earth is talked about, well, we don't have articles in Shawnees. We don't have a, and the. We don't have those things. So one of the ways we have to talk about things, we talk about, this or this here or this that is present in front of you, instead of rather than using an article. But it was actually the word itself, earth. It's like, what are we talking about here? What does earth mean, and how do we conceive this word? It's not just about soil. It's not just about a ball that's moving through the cosmos. It is about a being that is made of the entirety of the soil that is our mother. And so that word, as we were exploring how to express that word succinctly for the Sovereignty Symposium, became really interesting in the conceptualization of the way that we perceive the world. So again, hazarding it much with our linguists that are present, the Sapir-Whorf idea of the way that we speak and the way that we our first language, our mother language, frames the way we perceive the world. It also should frame the way that our governments are, our tribal nations, our governments and our courts. Because we have this, in English, we have this subject and predicate relationship with this SVO, and it's always SVO. And we always are concerned about the subject, the who. We want to give credit or blame constantly in this normative, dominative language. And in Shawnee, it is not this way, where the verb is the center of our universe. And there is not this demand on SVO relationship, subject, verb, object. It is, the verb is the center of the universe. And so that is a different understanding. And if that is a different understanding, then when we talk about family court, or we're in talking about how we understand canons of construction. Now I'm risking much with the lawyers that are present. How did folks, when we were writing, authoring treaties, how did we understand those treaties when we're thinking about things differently, where the subject does not have primacy, the verb has primacy? So how are we conceiving of this? And one of those examples, it was over at Muskogee Creek Nation some years ago when they were translating the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples into Muskogee. They were trying to articulate that for themselves, and what does this mean for us? Because there's certain areas of US law that doesn't protect what we have as a people. And they started to, first they took a moment and I don't think they called it this, but they defined their core principles. They started setting some definitions. What are those things that if they were to lose them, they would no longer be Muskogee? And it was from that framework that these fluent speakers approached the declaration. Each of those articles then had a Muskogee understanding, not a Western European understanding of the articles. And they started to redefine those and codify those in Muskogee Creek law, so that their understanding would help inform their courts of tradition. That way they have a traditional Muskogean jurisprudence system, and not one that was just a mirror of the court on the corner down the way. So for Shawnee people, these are the conversations that we're having internally as we're talking about also the intellectual property rights of our language. And we know that our language is an inherent being for us as well. And we wonder what the, we know that there's folks out there like there's Lakota community that has to pay a third party to get access to materials collected from their community. So this intellectual property that we should have inherently, this inherent right to our own intellectual property of our language. Those are inherent. They're unalienable. No one should be able to profit on those without the full conversation with the people, without, to use UN speak, free, prior, and informed consent. You shouldn't be vending back to a tribal nation, to a threatened language, the curriculum and language that you've built externally to try to profit from a people who's hurting. And the concerns that we have regarding the lessons that we have at Shawnee, now that we have what amounts to 4% of our population. 4% of the Shawnee population, what amounts to that, is now enrolled in the language program, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we have certainly moved the goalposts into our language. The death of our language now will occur in someone else's generation. It will not occur in mine. And so we've moved that goalpost. And when we talked to our language team, I was really excited that we had reached this place that we've now moved that into the land of somebody else's problem. Now we know that another administration, we're going to survive with our language. And the language team says, yeah, but we're not done. We intend to have fluent speakers by the end of the decade, children that are fluent speakers. So these are exciting times for us. But as we have expanded the communication, as we've expanded the curriculum, as we've created content, those items get away from us. And the intellectual property of those things start to land into bad actors. And we have to balance that, because we know that the language has to be in the hands of our people. That they have an inherent right to language. And it's not just our people, it's also the land itself, the land of where Shawnee people live, has the right to hear that language. It has the right to monolingualism should not be the normative. It should be a polyglot community, especially in Oklahoma. We have so many nations and so many languages. Our road signs should challenge the idea. So when a child is being driven to school by his parents, he sees road signs in multiple languages. And this idea of this monolingual normative is challenged and crushed. And that way children could grow up thinking that multilingualism is not just okay, it should be encouraged. And back to the language having rights, we use it for these sacred mysteries, death and life, whenever those things begin and end for us. And some of the things that we do is for the dead. And as we have these internal discussions about inherent rights, so too do the dead. The dead have right to ceremony, and the dead have right to the language, and the dead have the right to have that language spoken to them. So when we conduct these things, it is not just a right, it is incumbent on the living to make sure that we're doing these things for the dead. And so that's a different understanding. That's a totally different understanding than I think you'll find in most courtrooms here in the United States, with the way that we understand language rights. And so I want to cut it off. These are my reflections as Shawnee people in the Quechua, and I hope I've done my best, and I hope something's been meaningful to you and your people.
Thank you, Chief Barnes. And I so much appreciate, and I think everybody in the chat is echoing this thought, the way you've traverse the terrain from the practical utility of the decade, inspiring planning for 10 years, transcending the political life of any one tribal chairman toward goals of the people, doing that relationship between international and tribal experience. And then in the very same breath, you've been able to articulate in ways that are hard for so many of us how language relates to cosmology, and in particular, Shawnee cosmology and experience around the land and the sacred rituals, as you said. This is just so powerful how you're able to link these things together and share them so coherently. And I love that your administration and your time as chief is so deeply wedded to these human rights principles, language especially, but as they relate to other things too. And I know there are going to be a lot of questions for you when we get to the interactive session. But again, thank you for sharing your precious time as a tribal leader. I have a feeling people are probably knocking on your door outside every minute. So thank you. I'd like now to pass the baton to Dr. Ofelia Zepeda. And if people want to start putting questions for the speakers in the chat, that's fine. And we'll also use the raise hands function when we get to the Q&A. Dr. Zepeda?
Thank you, Kristen. Mabakaj ida matabinyuay masapan patman yajua iyak yaw journey. So it's my pleasure to be here this morning or this afternoon to participate on this wonderful panel. As always, though I've been around language so long, language work, I always learn something new. So I'm grateful to our panelists for sharing their work and their knowledge. On my part, I'd like to go ahead and open up with a little poem in O'odham, of course, and then move into English and then my comments. So the one I chose is sort of course, marking this time of the year, at least for us here in the desert, as we look towards the rain clouds. And like I said, an important time. And this is basically about the formation of the sky and eventual rain, and as it ties to language. Bishamanyamabata, abadakta bihimagokata, a bihimamjadak skirkaward, e the gokadak monan gomas, e the gokadak modabuka tatan, e the tatan, e the tatan modaga tatan. The tatin mowus and the bijmitahim. Summer clouds sit silently. They sit quietly gathering strength from the good wind, the strength that becomes the thunder so loud it vibrates the earth, the thunder that surrounds us. This is language. It is our strength, our way of life. The nyakot himdak, as we say in O'odham. It is always there when we need it. For many indigenous communities, the languages are quiet, resting, sleeping like the clouds that sit gathering strength for when they will be awakened by the people. When a language finally moves, it might be like desert clouds that so slowly build in the distance. It may take a generation or two before new speakers stand and pull on that energy that has always been there in their language. When they speak the words, they will know the powerful potential of a language. They will be like the thunderstorms we hear in the distance, and will feel them when they vibrate the earth beneath us. This is one way of looking at the efforts that are occurring among communities and language workers of indigenous languages in the US and around the world. I am fortunate to have grown up speaking my language and knowing the knowledge of the O'odham. I'm in a field where I can use my language as a part of a science and simultaneously as part of an aesthetic. As an O'odham, knowing how to use the language, how to perform in the language has traditionally been valued and respected by the people. Storytellers, orators, singers are all held in high regard. I am proud to be among them Even though the language I use in my poetry is more contemporary, it is still valued. Throughout the years, my work has allowed me to access and address policy needs for language education and revitalization, simply by virtue of the fact that I have been in the middle of it all for my whole academic career and practically my whole adult life. As a language teacher and researcher, I was part of a true grassroots effort in the late 1980s, shortly after I had just completed, or actually in the middle of my graduate work. This grassroots work was something that opened the eyes of so many to the condition of Indigenous language. And this was the passage of the U.S. Public Law 101-477, Native American Languages Act, also known as NALA 1990. This policy directed Congress to acknowledge the state of U.S. languages, that they were all at different levels of endangerment, meaning that many were losing speakers at alarming rates, some to the point of having only a handful of speakers, most of whom were the most elderly and most vulnerable. Something had to be done. The policy pointed to the US history at fault for this current condition. It pointed to the history of American Indian education, including boarding schools and institutionalized religions, among other national policies, early national policies. The Native American Language Act acknowledged the failure, again, of US treaty rights to meet the educational needs of Native American children. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Native American Language Act declared that it be the policy of the United States to preserve, protect, and promote the rights and freedoms of Native Americans to use, practice, and develop Native American languages. Many of the recommendations proposed in this policy have been addressed, but many of them still wait on the horizon. Primary concern, as we are all aware, has been funding. And in the reauthorization of NALA, funds were made available to support language revitalization and teaching through the Administration for Native Americans. These grants are also known as A&A grants. Many tribes and nations have benefited from these grants. In 2006, with another reauthorization of NALA, and it was renamed at that time the Esther Martinez Language Act, honoring the late Mrs. Martinez, language teacher and activist. This reauthorization directed funds specifically at grants for language nests, survival schools, and restoration programs, promoting language immersion for children with the goal of creating new speakers. With the success of these grants and other federal programs and private foundations were asked and sometimes educated to consider endangered languages as areas of funding. Funding was now put in place where it had not been before. For example, the Endangered Language Fund was formed, which is a nonprofit organization and is still around. The National Science Foundation created the Dell Grants Documenting Endangered Languages Grant, which directs researchers, academic researchers, to assist tribes in their language documentation and recovery efforts. All of these funds are still in place today, supporting language recovery, education, and documentation. However, we know it is not enough. Language loss continues. Much more work needs to be done. UNESCO's Declaration for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022 to 2032 will work to continue to bring attention to the status of Indigenous languages around the world and assist tribal nations to build on the work that they've been doing already. The decade will be impetus to bring language communities together to address common challenges and needs at the local and national level. It will encourage communities to draft policies to address their specific concerns or those held in common with other communities. Attention to children and language education, access to technology and information, and basic language and linguistic rights are just a few of the areas of concern for the decade. And there are many more, of course. As a member of the Unesco IDIL International Task Force, I have started to share information locally and nationally about the decade. In March, AHET, the American Indian Higher Education Consortium that oversees tribal colleges and universities, hosted their first language summit. At the summit, I presented and introduced the decade to the tribal colleges and universities. And then this month, some of us will gather in New Mexico to work with foundations and federal funding agencies on options for supporting efforts for the decade. This year and next year, the University of Arizona, my campus, will host multi-day workshops, both on campus and out in communities for tribes across the US to begin to draft projects, policies, and other directed goals for their communities for the decade. It will take some time and, of course, information sharing and support for communities to consider what the true realities might be during this decade for them. There is currently a US National Organizing Committee for IDIL, where language workers, advocates, and supporters come together to address goals for the US for the decade. This work is in its initial stages. I am hopeful that much will evolve through the decade. And I know as we gather, we continue, again, like the clouds, to pull on that power, that energy of the heat coming off the earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zepeda. That was a beautiful presentation. Thank you for the poetry and the image of the clouds, helping us to maybe develop a sense and a picture of where we are with our language efforts. And I'm hoping that we will grow like the thunder and make even louder sound in the future. But I also really admire the way you reviewed the federal legislation and the legislative history and the way it developed in terms of policy and also funding, because we've talked in the National Organizing Committee and elsewhere about how revitalizing languages, well, it's deeply a tribal effort in the way that Chief Barnes has talked about, it is also going to require some national policy reform. I think both around acknowledging the past harms and making the funding commensurate with the amount of money the government spent. I mean, maybe just as a benchmark, but studies have shown the federal government spent probably $1.8 billion in the boarding schools to eradicate tribal languages. And perhaps that could be a basis for revisiting some of the funding that you've talked about under the ANA grants and so on. And so thank you for reminding us of the federal legislation that we have to work with and hopefully to reform during this decade, and everything that you're doing to represent our group in the international settings and then to bring it home to these different associations and communities is also very important. So thank you. At this time, I'd like to invite my co-director, Sue Noe, if she'd like to provide any reflections, and then we'll open it up, as I mentioned, for Q&A from the audience, and folks can again put a question in the chat or raise their hands. As you're preparing your questions, we want to give everybody time, but it's helpful to keep the questions on the shorter end so that our presenters can have time to answer. Sue, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. Thank you, Kristen. Hello, everyone. As Kristen said, I'm Sue Noe. I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado. And along with Kristen, I'm co-director of the implementation project. And I'll keep my comments super short because I want to leave plenty of time for the Q&A. I know there's going to be a lively Q&A discussion on this great topic. I really want to thank all three of the speakers for your wonderful presentations. So moving, such great examples and such useful information. I think the connection between the language revitalization and the sustainable development goals, looking at what can be done and what needs to be done at the tribal, national, regional, and international levels is very helpful and interesting, and really happy to hear about the workshops that Dr. Zepeda and her university will be involved in for tribes across the US. It seems very important. And of course, the example of the Shawnee Tribe and all the great work that's being done there. I'm also really moved. I'm so moved by these discussions and the example, Chief Barnes, that you gave of the responsibilities as well, that the language rights and responsibilities of tribes, and that the land needs to hear the language, and just very, very moving. So I'll just close with that. I'm just so appreciative and very interested. I'm sorry that the U.S. Person wasn't here from the Department of Interior to speak. It would have been great to hear what the U.S. is planning, more about the U.S. position on these issues. And I don't know if during the Q&A, perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss some of that and what we would like to see happening at the federal level. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, Sue. And just on your last point, I think something we've learned here at the UN this week, or been reminded of, is that there's nothing stopping us from communicating by email or requesting meetings with US officials. And so even though they were sadly at the very last minute unable to attend, we could nonetheless, share some reflections from this meeting via email with some strategic copies to ensure a bit of accountability. So, maybe that's something to think about as we're both taking notes, perhaps. But I know we need more sustained engagement with the federal government as well. Well, I think I will now turn to our participants, and the first hand I see, and Kevin, feel free to let me know if I'm missing some, but is Mari Lamour. Would you like to take the floor?
Hi, yes, thank you for taking my question, and thank you to all of the participants and speakers today. I'm Mari Lamour. I am a non-Native woman living in Minnesota, and I would like to learn the traditional language of the Anishinaabe people. And I'm wondering if this is something I need to get permission to do, and if so, of whom do I ask permission? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mari. And one thing that we've done, Ophelia, would you like to take the floor in response?
If she's referring to, if you're referring to Ojibwe, the language of, one of the big languages of Minnesota,
yes,
that area,
yes,
yeah.
Ojibwe, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of language teachers that I know in that area, most of them, K-12 level, but I know in their, at a couple of their large campuses in Native studies, more so maybe anthropology and linguistics, they do offer, courses that are open, I mean, you would have to enroll, of course. So that's one way of accessing a language in an open setting, which I assume, I don't think there's any restrictions. Most language courses offered at universities have no restrictions as to who can take them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zepeda. And I was just going to say, from a broader perspective, I think this is such an interesting question, and one raised through the decade about whom has access to Indigenous languages. As Chief Barnes pointed out, I think sometimes Indigenous peoples can't access the material to study their own languages. And that's, particularly frustrating and upsetting when they're, suffering these harms. And from my experience, tribes have different views about this. Some, Cherokee Nation, for example, has almost all of its language programs available online. And I read, and that's Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, I read a really interesting piece from Eastern Cherokee where there was sort of encouragement of everybody to understand Cherokee as the language of that land, of that territory, and everybody within the territory, no matter what their background or citizenship status, should learn that out of understanding that they're residents of the place where that language is spoken. And then I've worked with other tribes for whom I think the recovery is such a sensitive point, and access to the materials and maybe private materials, that they're very concerned about intellectual property rights, exploitation by outsiders. And I like the point about classes that are offered at universities, because maybe some of those issues have been mediated a little bit along those lines already. Chief Barnes, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but knowing that you're so thoughtful about the issues of intellectual and cultural property, I was wondering if you might want to address this point.
We offer these are my Shawnee reflections again. So what we do is we offer our Shawnee language to all citizens of the Shawnee Tribe, all the people that should be citizens of the Shawnee Tribe or could be citizens of the Shawnee Tribe. Like, we have folks that are maybe they're two tribes, maybe they're let's say, let me pick a good one, that Muskogee Creek and Shawnee. So inside the Muskogee Creek Constitution, they may not allow for them to be citizens of the Shawnee Tribe at the same time as being a Muskogee citizen. So they would be a Muskogee citizen, but they would attend ceremonies with us. So we know that. So they attend our classes. Now, so our classes are somewhat open. They're not open to just the public. We do know that our information does get loose, and that becomes a problem for the leadership, the folks that are involved in the politics of the tribe, to go out there and advocate for intellectual property rights for our language materials, and also to try to find ways to articulate what the codification of protections might look like. But for advice for you, some real world advice is participate in a program where you're not paying a third party money. Participate in an official program, contact that nation and see what their protocol is for your attendance. They may have programs that you do pay to attend, and that's great, because if the tribe or the community is charging for attendance, then you're helping support those language programs. There's other ways to do is reach out to the tribe directly if you're interested, and make donations to their language communities, or to so I would just contact the tribal nation themselves first, or try to, if you're interested in a specific program, find out what its connection is to the community, so that you're not participating in a third party that's come and farmed language material from a community, extracted it like an extractive industry, left the community with this information, and now they're selling to the general public. So I would just be mindful. Don't center yourself, center the community as you're looking for a language material or language instruction.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chief Barnes. Shay Bronson Doherty, would you like to take the floor?
Hello. Thanks for giving me the time here. I really appreciate everybody sharing. This has been phenomenally enlightening. My name is Shay Bronson Doherty. I'm from the United States. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm currently living in Honduras. My wife is Tolupan, and we are engaging with the Federation of Tolupan Communities here, which is interested in recovering the Tolupan language, Tol. There's about 500 speakers left, most of which are older folks. with more than one dialect. And there's a few resources that are available that have been compiled over the years, mostly pretty basic dictionaries, and there's lots of inconsistencies. And the Federation is interested in engaging more actively in language revitalization programs, but they lack resources and in direction. And I guess what I'm asking more than anything is if anyone has any sort of contacts they could connect me to, if someone that has experience working in this sort of in language revitalization, someone who has a background in linguistics. We've been connected with the Department of History and Anthropology and the National University here in Honduras, where we're able to find folks that have worked in this previously, but don't quite have the expertise necessary or the funding to be able to put together something that would be more a document or resources that would be comprehensive enough to start using in public schools. The language has been used in 2 or 3 public schools, in primary schools in recent years, but the Federation of Tolupan Communities is interested in expanding that throughout the department where most Tolupan folks are living. And we're just kind of out of our depth in many different ways. I just wonder what sort of suggestions, what sort of resources you could point me to, or people that would be available for mentorship.
Thank you for the question. And I might give Ophelia, if she's willing to address it, a minute to answer, but this could also be a crowdsourcing question. And maybe if you could put your email in the chat, folks would send you some ideas. But Dr. Zepeda, would you like to address this question?
Yeah, yeah, that's in a way it's a difficult question because I mean, there's so many things that you mentioned, the different needs and challenges that you are facing, and sort of like, how do I get started, which is a hard one to deal with. But as far as looking for a resource, say if you're looking for a linguist or a language researcher, even sociolinguist or a cultural anthropologist that works in that area, you can, if you're interested in that type of person, you can start with their national organizations. There's some, of course, they're all over the world, actually. So in the United States, you have the American Anthropological Association, which includes linguists and sociolinguists and cultural anthropologists that work on languages in Mexico and South America. In the United States, there's also the Linguistic Society of America, which is a national organization that has a directory of certainly researchers, language researchers, linguists, sociolinguists, and others, and including graduate students who may be specializing in different parts of the world. But again, as Chief Barnes warned about, what be careful, how to search for the things that you want. It's always important, to inquire about the people that you see on paper and make sure that they are going to be safe people to work with and helpful people to work with, and would be people that are interested and committed to what you all are also, committed to, because that's a huge danger, to get the wrong person, and you'll waste time and money probably if you find the wrong person. So again, same thing, do a full and as possible investigation of the people you invite in to help you.
Thank you, Dr. Zepeda. And I just wrote that down. Be careful about how to search for the things that you want. I think is actually a really good reminder for all of us working in this space, and maybe especially for allies. Judge Bigler, would you like to take the floor?
Sure, thank you. I had 2 things. One is as to having these open access classrooms and so on. And of course, that is dependent upon what each tribal community or tribe wants to do. But I would note that, for instance, the UCHI had a orthography that some of the classes had produced in the late 1990s and 2000. and a fake group of claimed Uchis usurped that and used it, saying it was something that they'd had for generations as proof of their existence as Uchis. And they had no ties, they had no existence, they had no relation to us. And then they made up all these fake ceremonies and so forth. So these are things that we're concerned about as to ownership and legitimacy. Secondly, and I appreciate Dr. Zepeda. I've known her for some time, and lovely to see her again. And I know that there had been some efforts in the 1980s and so forth, and the reauthorization of the Language Act. But what is the obligation of, and how do we get them to up to their obligation for the federal government in the United States, at least, and I assume it's probably true other countries also, for their active suppression of the languages? They in the United States, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to actively suppress the native languages. And that is in large part why we are in the situation we are today. It seems that if they were willing to spend $500 million suppressing our languages, that perhaps they owe us more than $10 million a year to reactivate our languages. And so perhaps thoughts on that, and what strings might be tied to that we wouldn't be particularly happy with. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Bigler, and thank you for being such an incredible leader in our National Organizing Committee for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and seeing language as being part of society's flourishing, Indigenous society's flourishing. And I know you've been a big fan of Dr. Zepeda's poetry as an example of the sophistication of language in the cultural life of the community. And you're all reminding me that we probably need another meeting of our National Organizing Committee, because we haven't gotten together recently. But Dr. Zepeda, would you like to take on the question about the US obligations connected to legislation? And then Chief Barnes, if you'd like to, and Sue and I could maybe talk about what the declaration envisions there too.
Yeah, I like that. Oh, it's great to see you, Judge Bigler. Again, even though it's your picture, but now you're there. Yeah, as you said, I mean, it's interesting, you know, those numbers, the dollar numbers that you mentioned, you know, and those are sort of sometimes very real for people. Certainly for tribal people, it starts to make sense. You know, this is how much they spend to, you know, suppress the language, and of course, eventually some have been suppressed for way too long, and it's taken much longer and much more effort, and of course the resources to bring them back, but people continue to try, and it's a tremendous journey, tremendous, you know, amount of time and commitment on behalf of individuals who want to do that and make it their work. So it's a huge investment, you know, to bring back a language, and so you can quantify it, you know, in hours and in, I think, dollar figures, as you sort of mentioned. And, you know, I think it'd be great to put those numbers together, you know, those kinds of projections, and lay it out, even using the decade and putting a number to each year of the decade for, you know, paying, whether it's some restitution or else, for resources for communities to support them to bring back their languages. And, you know, I think it would certainly make a huge difference, especially when we look at it that way, where the whole US is making that effort, you know, and I think will be very impactful to the languages. As far as, you know, people in Washington and our leaders there, I think there's some good people in place right now, but of course, you know, we're already looking at elections just down the road, and, you know, where things will go with that is of course uncertain right now, but it could certainly get dangerous again. But I think taking advantage of the administration that's there right now and the good people we have there, who I think are open, more open, than other administrations, to be able to take advantage, of their positions at this point. I think it's something that we should be doing. I'm happy to help anyone who can get that machine moving. I don't always have those type of connections, but I'm happy to support anyone who is going, is willing to do that, or any group or organization that is willing to do that. But that's just my immediate thoughts, Judge Bigler.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zepeda, and I appreciate how both of you are kind of getting us in this mind frame of what do we want to do next, and what measures actually do we want to request of our government, and what standards should guide that. After I invite Chief Barnes to respond to this question, I'm actually going to put up a few slides that show the declaration standards and say what states are actually obligated to do, just in case people want to see them for a second. Chief Barnes, would you like to say something on this topic?
Yeah, I would. In terms of what we're doing here in the United States, I am hopeful. I'm very hopeful. I don't know if we've ever had someone with a profile like Daryl Baldwin, who was appointed to the National Council on the Humanities at the National Endowment for the Humanities. And he's a linguist. He's not just a linguist. He is someone that is boots on the ground, recover the language work. He's doesn't work in theoretical. He put in the hours, the blood, sweat, and tears to bring back his people's language, from a period of what I believe they described as dormancy. And so I'm encouraged that now we have that level of someone at any age to help shape policy regarding language. But I also know politics, and I know how things are. And recently I've had a shifting opinion on the way that we do language grant funding. Whenever we saw the coronavirus, the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, it was they picked an arbitrary number to throw at additional language support monies. And I was like, how did you didn't talk to us. No one talked to the Shawnee and asked us, how many speakers did you lose? What will you need to undo that loss to mitigate the loss of these treasures to your community? No one talked to us. They just picked an arbitrary number at random. And isn't that what we've been doing all along with ANA funding? Is we just have this little small pool of money, and they make us fight over it with this limited applications that are approved. And it's only a 3-year program at the most, I believe. And they also allow NGOs and 501c3s to author for that money, not just tribal nations and communities. So it fundamentally has a flaw. So I'm starting to advocate for better ways. And I think Daryl was a great person to work from the inside and to have those conversations. But I think we need to have those conversations and try to articulate what it is, how best we sustain it. Generations were spent stamping out our language. A 1, 2, 3-year grant is not going to fix it. But I want to address Shay Bronson Doherty's question for a minute. My problems are first world problems. I worry about folks in the Honduras language community, because Adam Gowdry, a Canadian scholar, talks about how cultural revitalization is the new activism. A lot of these folks involved in language revitalization are activists, and they're not popular with regimes. And so while Ophelia, Greg, myself, Kristen, no one's going to come for our families when we criticize American policy on language. But I worry about I would tread carefully in certain communities, because some of these folks in Honduras with Tibetans, a Uyghur community in China, be very cautious in how you approach those communities, because it could literally cost people. If you're working in an international arena on language, just be mindful, tread carefully.
Thank you, Chief Barnes. I really appreciate that latter point, especially since we're here at the United Nations. And when I was chairing MRIP more than once, when somebody from an Indigenous human rights defender from another country made a statement, their families did experience retaliation and even murders, assassinations in their home countries when they spoke up about these rights. And I think in solidarity across the world among Indigenous peoples, we need to realize that, and especially people in conflict zones where there's oppression and so on. I really do take that to heart. What I know we only have 5 minutes, but I am going to put up the terms on the declaration just for a minute if folks want to see. And Ben, will you just nod if you can see this? Okay, great. So I won't do the law professor thing here, but I'm going to mention 3 articles of the declaration. So Indigenous peoples have the right not to be subjected to destruction of their culture. We know that happened through the boarding school and other policies. What standards, Judge Bagler asked, are the states like the United States entitled to meet? Well, what the declaration says is that states like the United States have to provide redress for forced assimilation and destruction of the culture, including the language. So one thing I would love to see during this, I mean, if I were writing the National Action Plan for the United States, I would say, this is what we did, this is what our obligation is, and work with tribes to figure out what would be meaningful redress of that action in the past. And then there are more specific articles on language, and states have to take measures to ensure that Indigenous people can participate in all of these realms of life, legal, social, otherwise, in their own languages. States have to provide translation, interpretation, and also that states have an obligation to make sure Indigenous children can be educated in their own languages, right? So those could all be their lofty universal expressions, but they could be put into policy prescriptions and funding levels for the United States, over the next 10 years, 20 years, and so on. So I'll stop the share so we can all see each other, but I think there are some guidelines, and in fact, there are universal human rights that have been articulated that the US already supports, that our project is devoted to, enhancing, that I'd love to see us, bring to the US and request some redress, seriously. I don't know if people have thoughts on that point. I know it's a political struggle since we can't even get the US on the phone to talk about it, but any last comments? We've got 2 minutes left. We're usually running over, but if anybody wants to take the last minute or so, we'd be glad to hear from them.
Well, Kristen, I was wondering if Dr. Zepeda might give us a little bit more information about the workshops that you're planning. And Dr. Zepeda, part of what we're doing at the implementation project is a series of in-person workshops for tribes in different regions in the US. And one of the components is typically on language rights. And so we'd be very interested to hear about what you're doing and possibly spread the word about your workshops as well.
Yes, right now this spring we started planning some of these, so hopefully we'll get started in the early fall. So some will be on our campus, others will be out in communities where people are allowed to gather now. So the workshops essentially will be coming out of our Language Institute here at the University of Arizona. And we're going to start in the Southwest and try and traverse across the country, but also recruit some of our sister language institutes in different parts of the country to replicate and hold these workshops. So the workshops will be designed, for tribal communities who have some ideas of what they would like to start to propose, whether it's policy or just some programmatic development, or else how to address their own tribal leadership with supporting their own efforts as language programs, because we know oftentimes language programs get ignored by the leadership and or else are not used fully. Anyway, so it's just sort of refreshing some of the things that a language program, a tribal language program can do, and certainly using the decade to enhance some of their efforts So we're going to, just lay out a lot of different things that we know language programs do and want to do, and work with them to design, very good plans for themselves, whether it's just for their community or else if they're working across the state with related languages, across the, the region with related languages on policy that's specific to them, or else perhaps start some national movements from some of those initial workshops. So anyway, we'll see how it progresses. And I think people will be interested. We've heard a lot already, of people wanting help, or also just to share ideas, talk with each other and build from that.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue and Dr. Zepeda. And we would love, I know we have lots of channels of communication, but we'd love to hear more about those and help spread the word or just learn about what you're doing as they unfold. So thank you for sharing. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining. I learned this on another side event. I don't know if people will do it, but if you would turn on your camera for just a minute so we could take a side event photo since we're not here in person. I don't know how many folks, I can take my screenshot, see all of your bright shining faces. Oh, this is great. Yay. Okay. Everybody, oh, hold on one sec. Okay, great. 1, 2, 3. Everybody say International Decade of Indigenous. No, I'm just kidding. All right, cheese. That's a mouthful. Thank you so much. I realize that it's the International Decade, and I usually try to speak the language I'm studying, Cherokee, at least once a day during this decade, and I forgot to do it at the beginning. So I'll just say Wado, Donondago Hai, and I will see you all soon. Take care.